I got to know my friend Paul Thomlinson 25 years ago when I was a board member at Borough Mental Health. And I wrote a grant to do a research project looking into methamphetamine addiction in Missouri. Paul was appointed to head up the research project. And like a lot of people who want to do a research project, I thought I knew what the answers were when we were going into it. I assumed that we would find people using meth to cope with the tedium of factory jobs, or to control their weight, or to self-medicate for depression or bipolar disorders. I was so sure of that when I was doing the interviews that I was assigned, I literally looked for confirmation of my bias. It just wasn't there. What Paul and I and the 6 or 7 other people involved in interviewing addicts learned is that there was almost never a conscious reason for the first use of meth. They all reported to us that they were introduced to meth in a social setting in which it was given to them, and they took it in order to fit in to the social setting that they were in. So then to ask someone to just say no is a tall order when most of the people in our society are suffering from loneliness. The desire to fit in, to have a peer group, to be included in a circle of friends, a reliable group, whether it was terribly meaningful or not, but drug users are a tight group. In the absence of confidence that comes from strong family ties, or a meaningful love connection, or a purposeful career, that really positive and reliable connections to friends in society, neighbors, co-workers, those people become terribly vulnerable to almost any suggestion, even a suggestion as colossally stupid as, "Here, take this." Now, Paul will be speaking in a few minutes, and he'll speak most directly to the best practices in suicide prevention, in treating and preventing drug addiction, and in treating and avoiding serious episodes of depression. But for my part, speaking pastorally, when you think about a 20-year-old college student walking into a party where someone might just offer them meth, or now heroin, fentanyl, or oxy, what do you think is their best defense? Do they need a week of education into the physiological and psychological effects of drugs? Or do they need a secure knowledge that they are loved, accepted, and that their future life has meaning in it? The problem with telling people to just say no, or telling them about effects of neuroreceptors in your brain or possible birth defects, is that when you are in pain, there is no moment except right now. The present moment is the only thing that matters. If someone doesn't have a heartfelt, passionate belief in their value and their value to the future, asking them to avoid the consequences of anything is almost impossible. Now, people can feel lonely, unloved, unneeded, even when they're surrounded by loving friends and family for whom they are regarded as being virtually heroic. There's no perfect predictor, and there's no perfect prevention of depression, suicide, or addiction. And I want to add, when we went into this research, we knew that meth was highly addictive. In fact, of the more than 60 addicts we interviewed, all of them used meth a second time within 24 hours of their first use. Most were within 12 hours. Now, that's about as bad as it gets. But given what we've all heard about meth and meth addiction over the past few years, what would you think if your pediatrician suggested that you give your kid a dose of meth once or twice a day to help them behave better in school? Adderall is the name Shire Pharmaceuticals gave to their prescription form of methamphetamine. Yeah, the drug that was developed to give to Nazi soldiers so that they would ferociously and insanely charge into battle, the drug used for orgies and the sex trade, is the drug that we give to kids to help them with ADD. Now, I'm not a medical professional, and I've been warned by people that I should be careful about talking about this. And I realize that ADD is serious. I don't have it, but I'm sympathetic for the people who need treatment. But there are 5 million people in America today taking Adderall. Do 5 million people need prescription methamphetamine? And is Adderall in its prescription form any less addictive than the meth that you buy on street corners? What would you guess? And if you doubt me, check the Google machine, and you will find countless articles in major newspapers about Adderall addiction. I've lost patience with the protections that our government affords the pharmaceutical industry. They are killing us, and they are turning an entire generation of children into tweakers. I would love to challenge the experts on ADD. Is meth really the best idea you've got? And if it is, why don't you get a research grant and find a better treatment? I accept that ADD needs to be treated. I am deeply cynical about whether it needs to be treated with methamphetamine. But I must turn the page. Whenever Paul and I talk about suicide causes and prevention, I always return to examples like Robin Williams and Anthony Bourdain, because almost everything that we tend to say about why people commit suicide does not, at least on the surface, appear to apply to these two high-profile cases. And Paul does forensic work with suicide, so he'll have more to say about it than I could say. But I was shocked in both cases to think that wildly popular, intelligent, world-traveled, creative people would choose to end their own life. So whenever I try to talk about suicide, I recognize there has to be some element of humility, that the litmus test is anything but certain. Again, though, in matters of psychology, we say that when we hear hoofbeats, we think about horses and not zebras. A lot of the time, especially when you hear me talking about affects of psychological issues, I'm always talking about a majority position. There's always outliers. When we ask ourselves, why did this particular person commit suicide? There's always a host of possible causes or reasons, many of which they would never dare to mention in a suicide note. Just because a person leaves a note doesn't mean that they're telling you the truth. They could be telling you their cover story. But if I may offer a large umbrella of causation, and I'll be interested to know Paul's take on this as well, but most suicide victims seem to feel that they are somehow a burden, an embarrassment, that they're somehow in the way and unneeded by the people closest to them. And to say that, you have to set aside all of the suicidal gestures made for attention-getting purposes or for control of family members, which we see very commonly with borderline personality disorders and things of that ilk. And this gets very complicated because borderlines will make lots of suicidal gestures in order to get attention or to scare people around them. Surface cuts, and I had one client who hit her leg with a hammer, and she said she was trying to kill herself. And I said, "Were you going to beat your leg off and work your way up to a vital organ? How did you see that working out?" But there are a lot of self-destructive gestures done by borderlines that are not really suicide. But you have to be very careful about responding to that, because borderlines will tend to make a more and more serious suicidal gesture when people stop responding the way they want them to. But the people who actually commit suicide oftentimes have been publicly humiliated, they've become a financial burden, or they appear to be a reputation liability to their family. Now, over the years, Paul and I have done a lot of conferences together, Sometimes I speak and he sings. Sometimes he speaks and I never sing. But a couple of years ago, we were meeting with a committee planning a teen suicide prevention event, and I brought up this fact, that suicide is the number 2 reason for death among teenagers, but gay teens of all racial and ethnic groups are 4 to 5 times as likely to commit suicide as their heterosexual peers. 4 to 5 times as likely. Now, there are complicating factors when you talk about suicide. This just isn't one of the complicating factors. This one's easy. This one lies right on the surface. Let me take you back to your freshman logic course, assuming you took one. People commit suicide because they feel that they are a shame or a burden. Gay teens are 4 to 5 times as likely to commit suicide, so it follows that gay teens are much more likely to feel shame or to feel that they are a burden. Why? Who teaches gay kids that it's not okay to be gay? Who makes them feel fear? Who teaches them to fear that their families would reject them if they find out? Religion, churches teach gay kids to loathe themselves so much that they are 500% more likely to kill themselves than just your typical anxiety-riddled teenager. And this, ladies and gentlemen, was when I was informed that I would not be speaking at that conference. A survivor whose husband had committed suicide looked at me several times during our lunch meeting and declared, "My husband was not gay." I never said he was. I never even said that most teen suicides are gay kids. You know, there's 5 to 10% of society is gay. Just the numbers that wouldn't work out. I never implied that the majority of people who committed suicide were gay. I'm just saying that gay kids are much more likely than straight kids. It's important for you to hear me saying a suicide attempt is not evidence of a person's sexual orientation. But the fact that this woman felt the need to repeat over and over that her husband was not gay tells me a couple of things. One is that she still bears that indigenous prejudice against being gay, that just the suggestion that her husband might have been gay was offensive to her. And the second was the fact that she kept bringing it up in the conversation when we had moved on to talk about other things made me wonder if maybe her husband had been gay. But of course, as they say, that is none of my business. But here is what is my business, because I'm a minister, and here is what I might have said if I'd been allowed on stage with Paul at that event. Being a homosexual is no more a sin than having red hair or brown eyes. Your gender orientation, while it might be in some ways influenced by environment, it is indisputably overwhelmingly a condition of birth, and judging anyone for their sexual orientation, whether that's family judgment, religious judgment, is flat out wrong. There is no excuse for it. And that's not just my opinion. That's not just medical evidence. That's not just psychological conclusions. I will argue that is theologically true. And if you disagree, you are just wrong, period. This conversation has been carried out for generations, and there is no further need of evidence. Now, I'm going to leave it to Paul to talk about suicide prevention in a broader context. But we're in a church, and I'm a 40-year veteran of the clergy, and I need to speak to this particular piece of real estate. The Catholic Church's 16th century-long oppression of women, treating them as second-class citizens who can never become a member of the clergy, and their continued insistence that being homosexual is a sin for which one will burn eternally in their imaginary and non-existent hell is not acceptable. I don't care that there are progressive priests who are trying to change this. I don't care that most Catholics ignore these antiquated and abusive beliefs. The fact is that there's a casualty count involved. Children and adults are killing themselves because the church has condemned them for a condition of their birth. It is 2019. If the Catholic Church changed today, it would still be 2 generations late. You don't get any more time. Your time is up. And the evangelical churches, of which the Assemblies of God, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, all that sort may be the worst offenders, but even the United Methodist Church just voted in favor of maintaining this bigotry, and a lot of other denominations that have always enjoyed being called mainstream have sat on the fence for way too long. It is 2019. You cannot maintain that position any longer. If you knew someone who was taking their kids to some cult meeting where they were being taught to loathe themselves, to despise who they are and cannot help being, you would report that person for child abuse, wouldn't you? I mean, you should. But if your neighbor is taking their kids to a Catholic church that's been teaching this for 1,600 years, why does that make it acceptable? Why do they get a pass? How is it that most Protestant churches get a pass on child abuse just because they've been doing it for 500 years? It's unacceptable. It has to stop. Parents, you cannot look at your children and tell which ones are going to be gay. If you take your kids to a church that teaches them that hell awaits gay people, you are setting your children up to become suicide victims. So I have this modest proposal. Parents, love your children. Not just some of them, love all of them. No matter what, love your kids.
Good morning. I'm Rob Martin. Most of you, those of you in the sanctuary, know me as the guy who's usually in the back of the room trying to get the sound and lighting right. For those in our online audience, I'm the person who packages our sermons up every week and gets them out on our iTunes and YouTube channels. This church has always been a little bit of an experiment. Can you build a progressive, intellectually honest community way out here on East Cherry Street in Springfield, Missouri? And can you expand that community to an online audience who's hungry for a progressive religious message, but who's located all over the world? Somehow, here in our little city in the Ozarks and on our corner of the internet, we've made this experiment work. We've built a community of people who care deeply about each other and about making our world a better, more honest place. Our budget is very lean, but it does take regular, sustained contributions to keep operating. In the 10 years I've been part of this community, I don't think we've ever felt financially secure, but the last several months have been particularly challenging. If you've been thinking about starting to donate or increasing your regular contribution, now is the time. If you care about this community, join me in making a sacrifice to ensure its survival. If you're joining us online, please consider visiting our website at spfccc.org and clicking the donate button. If you'd like to partner with us in really sustaining this community, you can check the Make This a Monthly Donation checkbox on the page where you enter your donation amount. The offering will now be given and received.
I want to talk to you about root causes today. We're always looking for root causes in healthcare and behavioral health, where bad outcomes are a fact of life. You always want to know, why? Why did that happen? We're always trying to get upstream a little bit, far enough to really get to the root cause, so we can figure out why people are sick, why they're depressed, why they're dying from opioid overdose, why they're depressed, why they die by suicide. In fact, there's a technique called in root cause analysis called the 5 whys, W-H-Y, the 5 whys, wherein we ask up to 5 times, actually it can be more than that, but usually you get there before 5. When we ask, why? So we can get to the root cause. What's really driving this? For example, a facile example, I got a speeding ticket. Why? Because I was late for work, driving fast to get there. Why was I late for work? Because I overslept. Why did I oversleep? Because the alarm clock didn't go off. Why didn't the alarm clock go off? Because the batteries were dead. And why were the batteries dead? I forgot to change them. Oh, there's the cause, kind of. That's the thing we can do something about. We can plug a clock in or, have a schedule on our phone that tells us when to change the batteries. There's something we can do something about. Of course, a very simple example, just to illustrate that concept of root cause analysis in the 5 whys. But I can tell you, after many years of reviewing deaths by suicide, poor outcomes in depression care, etc., you ask enough times why, you'll almost always eventually get to the root cause of disconnection from others and the terrible downstream consequences that come from the state of loneliness. So what do we mean by loneliness? I know this seems like, is he really? Yes, I'm really talking about this. It's common sense, you'd think, right? It's not so common. Pretty rare sense, as a matter of fact. It should be clear that loneliness is not at all related to the actual number of friends or social contacts we have. Most of us probably have had the feeling, in fact, of being alone in the crowd, right? There's almost nothing more excruciating than that. That amplifies the feeling of loneliness in a way. Roger mentioned Anthony Bourdain and Robin Williams, 2 fabulously wealthy, popular, famous men with friends possessed, as Shakespeare would say, who died by suicide. Yet, in retrospect, a psychological autopsy would almost certainly have shown that, in fact, they were excruciatingly lonely. Loneliness is that emotional state created when people have fewer meaningful relationships than they want, fewer than they need. That is, they have inadequate relationships to make them feel known and understood. How do we define it? Basically, irrespective of the number of folks in your contacts on your phone or your Facebook list, friends list, if you feel lonely, you're lonely. Loneliness is characterized by emotional suffering created from feeling separate, isolated, alone, disconnected. By way of reference, you can listen to the Hank Williams masterpiece, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, which I heard my dad sing many, many times when I was a kid, for a musical deep dive into the emotional experience of loneliness. Loneliness is literally painful. It is also fearful. At the heart of it is an often deep-seated fear that our life-giving and nourishing attachments to others are missing or are at risk of being pulled apart or shattered. These fears are most all of us experience these fears at some point, carrying within that disturbing sense that there's this impending incompleteness, an insecurity, a lack of grounding. I want to point out the crucial distinction between distressing loneliness and solitude. Aloneness differs from loneliness. Of course, we know that Eastern and many meditative and mindfulness approaches regard solitude as an essential and healthy state, characterized by feelings of trust and security and wholeness that leads to an equanimity and calmness rather than distress. That's a sharp contrast to the yawning chasm of loneliness in which so many people seem to find themselves these days. The epidemic of loneliness, you may have heard. Although living alone does not always equate to being lonely, we know that 1/4 of the U.S. population and 28% of older adults live alone. Nearly half of adults, 47% to be exact, characterize themselves as lonely right now. That's about twice as many as a couple of decades ago. 13% of people, 13%, weird number, but 13% say they have 0 people who know them well. That's a lot of people that are disconnected. If you have no one in your life that knows you well, the risk factor is enormous, and we'll see why in a minute. We're living through what I think is rightly called an epidemic of loneliness. I had the privilege of hearing former Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy recently, and this stuck with me when he said, quote, "During my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness." So why the epidemic? Well, as in all things, there's no single magic bullet answer to that. No single answer to the question of why twice as many people now feel lonely as did a few decades ago. Why the average American's number of close confidants has shrunk by more than 1/3 since 1985. But here's some possible causes really quickly. One could be the aging of the boomers, who had fewer children and more divorces than their parents, leaving many without companions in their our old age. About 10% of Americans over 50 do not have a spouse, a romantic partner, or a living child. So about 1 in 6 boomers lives alone. It's one thing. It's possible that the new gig economy and the transient nature of work these days is making people lonely, as Americans are forced to leave families and hometowns for their careers or paychecks. And maybe we've somehow gotten dramatically worse at meeting basic human needs, which every Psych 101 student who's ever taken a gander at Maslow's hierarchy will tell you is pretty important. Johann Hari has put it in his simple but radical book, Lost Connections, this way, quote, "We all know that every human being has physical needs for food, water, shelter, for clean air. Turns out in the same way," he's British by the way, so he talks like this, turns out in the same way, all humans have certain basic psychological needs. We need to feel we belong. We need to feel valued. We need to feel we're good at something. We need to feel we have a secure future. And there is growing evidence that our culture isn't meeting those psychological needs for many, perhaps most people. So having established that there is an epidemic, what are the consequences to our health and well-being, including, as we've titled this, America's Diseases? Some time ago, we heard from Mayo Clinic physician Dr. James Levine that sitting is the new smoking. You heard that? In fact, I wrote a little song about it. I'll share with you if you'd like later. Warning about the harmful health effects of a sedentary lifestyle. So I'm here today to assert that it's not too much of a stretch to say that loneliness is the new smoking. In fact, there's an interesting study I want to quote here. The health impact of loneliness and social isolation has roughly been equated to the effects of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And that very same study established this also shows that loneliness causes a 26% increase in mortality. That's people dying, of course. So why or how is physical health affected by loneliness? Isn't that just some woo-woo nonsense? People know. It's a real thing. What is the virus, the bacterium, the teratogen? What is the cause embedded in that equation? Not surprisingly, it's stress, actually. We're animals, right? But we are exquisitely entrained social animals above almost all else. Feelings of loneliness are an evolutionary phenomenon, to be certain. In the same fashion that hunger drives animals to seek and find food, loneliness drives humans to fervently desire and seek out the protection of connection. To the group, that is. Increasing our chances of survival. There's safety in numbers, right? We all feel that intimately. By the way, on this point, I love the way Dr. John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, who's a loneliness researcher and a neuroscientist, put it this way: denying you feel lonely makes no more sense than denying you're hungry. Although Roger and I are trying to deny that a lot these days. Have you ever thought about just being hungry and not eating? That makes it a real victory. It's no victory to not eat when you're not hungry. How does this relate to stress and the negative effects on health? Well, we know from psychoneuroimmunology, there's a multisyllabic example of my sesquipedalianism, right? Psychoneuroimmunology, put the words together, psychological, neurological, immunological research all mashed up. We know from this research that our loneliness, that is feeling isolated, vulnerable, on our own, triggers the release of stress hormones. We've already heard the name this morning, cortisol. Cortisol is our friend in some cases, most cases, but not others. The stress hormone is remarkable and necessary. In small doses helps maintain a vigilance and alertness to dangers in the environment. But when our bloodstream is flooded with it and other stress hormones continuously for prolonged periods, it causes great harm by leading directly to high blood pressure, which we know is a #1 risk factor for all cardiovascular diseases, from stroke to heart attack. It leads to increased inflammation. We're learning more and more all the time about the inflammation hypothesis being correct, that it's responsible for everything from gingivitis to stroke. It leads to all manner of horrible health outcomes, and also a weakened immune system, which leaves us open to opportunistic infections, of which there are seemingly endless new varieties in the world today. Without a warm, nourishing emotional support network, or even just one single source of support, lonely people are undoubtedly more likely to fall prey to unhealthy habits, including substance abuse, overeating, and not exercising. So perhaps loneliness is a root cause for not moving. So more evidence for my assertion that loneliness is in fact the new smoking. I also want to summarize and put a finer point on loneliness and America's diseases of depression, addiction, and suicide. There's no question, if you give a fair reading of the credible research, that lonely individuals are more prone to depression. Again, not surprising, but there is fairly irrefutable scientific evidence of that fact. It's also clear that addiction is very often rooted in disconnection and alienation from others, like those solitary rats in an empty and desolate cage who consumed the heroin-laced water, oftentimes till they died. Why? There's the why. Because their lives sucked, and they were devoid of connection to anything other than that heroin nipple and the resulting high. That was the only connection they had, so they used it till they died. What a powerful metaphor. And we know that loneliness and low levels of social interaction predict suicide in all age groups, and especially in older age. The very best research-based model for suicide prevention and protection, developed and tested by a guy that I've had the pleasure of working with several times, Tom Joyner at Florida State University. It shows that those who hold the twin psychological states of lack of belonging and a sense of, as Roger said earlier, burdensomeness, that I am a burden financially, emotionally, reputationally, whatever, to other people. You hold those twin states long enough, and many of us do, by the way, feel like a burden and feel a lack of belonging or connection. You hold those two long enough, you're gonna feel like dying. Thank God most people don't. There's another factor, which we'll get into another time, that has to do with learning how to approach lethal means and getting comfortable with lethal means and so forth. But when you think about what makes people want to die, it's not connecting with people and feeling like you're a burden to the ones that you do have in your life. Hold those two long enough, you're going to want to check out. Almost always. Again, doesn't mean you will, but it means you're going to want to. So a good research-based suicide prevention model would focus a lot on helping people connect, helping people feel as though they do belong, and helping them reduce the sense that they are a burden to you specifically. You're the only one you can help them with, right? You can try to convince them of everybody else, but you're the one you can help them with, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Those two states of psychological, the two psychological states, burdensomeness and lack of belongingness, will cause folks to want to take their lives. And many of them, of course, do. So I want to take a little side journey here, because this church is, in fact, a beacon in the wilderness about, maybe we should reach across and embrace, folks who are not like us and so forth. We often lament the state of political polarization in which we are living, and it's worse than I've ever seen it, maybe worse than it's ever been in this country, I don't know. But while we're looking for root causes, hey, loneliness might be there. Think about that for a second. Psychiatrists Olds and Schwartz describe loneliness as the elephant in the room of American politics. The reasoning goes like this. Social isolation makes people less empathetic, less empathic, and more likely to view the world in terms of us and them, bipolar terms, so to speak. Olds puts it this way, quote, "I think comparing notes in a civil way is the antidote to a polarized society in which we don't understand a point of view other than our own. If we're so lonely that we have no one to compare notes with, we tend to become polarized." That's one possibility on the equation. Also, and it may be, as Republican Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska asserts in his book, Them, Why We Hate Each Other and How to Heal, we may be turning to political tribalism for the essential sense of community we used to get from simple connection to people around us. It's a poor substitute, my friends. I think Senator nails it when he writes, "Alienated from each other, uprooted from places we can call home, we're reduced to shrieking." I'm about done with the shrieking. So let me close with the connection solution. Loneliness is an epidemic, as we've established, but it's preventable, treatable, and manageable. Sounds like I'm talking about high blood pressure, right? Psychologists and social scientists have known for a long time that both intellectual and social engagement prevents loneliness and its damaging physical and psychological effects. The active ingredient is relationships that are high quality, not merely extensive in number. The quality of our relationships is what predicts whether we feel lonely or not. Relationships that have authenticity to them. Relationships where one or more of the parties engaged is not phoning it in, going through the motions, pretending to care because that's what good people do, whatever. Authentic, connected relationships, meaningful relationships, richness in their relationship, depth, and reciprocity, by the way. One of the most fundamental ingrained norms is very important in relationships, obviously. And it's also connected, you look at that model of suicide prevention, the folks who are actually prevented from dying by suicide, they don't just have people who care about them, they have someone about whom they care and connect with. It's about reciprocity. The one-way flow is not enough. That's not a relationship. Reciprocity is key. As an antidote to loneliness, there's no real substitute for having someone to talk to regularly, someone with which to share the contents of our hearts and minds. As shameful, dirty, and awful as we might think that those contents are, we need someone to share them with. And all the good stuff too, but that's the easier one. There's also good evidence that mindfulness exercises can help reduce feelings of isolation by creating a sense of connection to the world, to others, or even to the universe. In fact, I think we need to be careful about expecting too many of the benefits of connection with others before we deal with that fundamental, crucial connection, the most important one of all, the connection to self. There's a reason that Dr. Dan Goleman and others have called self-awareness the very cornerstone of emotional intelligence. There's a reason the Oracle at Delphi dispensed the exhortation to know thyself. That's the most fundamental connection without which relationships with others really are difficult to have for very long. But God bless good-hearted warriors in the fight against loneliness, like Robin Caruso out in D.C., whose Togetherness initiative aims to combat the epidemic among seniors with weekly phone calls and home visits and community engagement programs. Those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. The evidence is still coming in about the effectiveness of befriending programs and that sort of thing, so I don't get into all that. But what we know for sure is that the simple act of reaching out, sometimes in what you might consider the most random way, can, and again, it's not hyperbole to say you can save a life by saying a kind word to someone. I've heard it over and over in the situations where I had dealing with someone who is a suicide attempt survivor. There's always another person. It's always someone else. In the case of Kevin Hines, who's maybe the most high-profile suicide attempt survivor in the world, who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, one of the tiny fraction of people who actually survived that. And it was actually sea lions in that case that came and swam with him while he was there with his broken back, kind of bobbing in the San Francisco Bay. But there's almost always a connection to another human being in the prevention of suicide. One person, maybe even a random person. And by the way, Kevin Hines also tells the story about being on the bus on the way to the Golden Gate Bridge with the full intention of jumping off and dying. And he had playing those mental games that we sometimes play. And he said, I'm on a bus in San Francisco. If I have one person between now and the time I get to the place where I get over the railing, one person who just asks me how I'm doing, I won't do it. Nobody did. He thought he was going to be saved at the very end. There was a German woman, said, very well turned out, beautiful German tourist who came toward him as he was standing on the Golden Gate Bridge about to jump off. And he thought, here it is, there's my salvation. And she said, would you take a picture of me? Wasn't enough. He was looking for something more than that. But the point is, it's not enough. God bless you in reaching out to anybody who's lonely. And we all have examples and opportunities every single day to do that in a warm and genuine way. But it's not only important that you do it, but how you do it, turns out, is very important. It's important how we talk to them, how we interact with them. Lonely people very often have the perception, not surprisingly, that others are not listening to them, that they're not being taken seriously. They very rarely have eye contact, that sort of thing. And folks who are that crushingly lonely, that's not enough. Again, phoning it in. They have the perception that you don't care about them already, so you have to do something to break through that. Basically, they're being dismissed, or so they feel, so you have to convince them otherwise. In closing, we need to be careful to do the opposite of all those things. Be not false in your affections. Use active listening skills. Lean into it. Reflect back that you heard what they said, and you may help add years to someone's life as well as life to someone's years.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.